Okay, well, welcome everybody to Radical Anthropology. And tonight we have a really special guest, Gabriella Kountourides, who is a DPhil candidate in Oxford University Department of Anthropology, presenting her very recent research on biosocial perspectives on the premenstrual experience. Gabriella comes from a zoology background, but did the evolution of human behavior masters at UCL. And I think, Gabriella, that's when you were also attending some of RAG, weren't you? You came to RAG sometime. So radical anthropology obviously is very, very interested in the subject of menstruation. So we're very eager to hear what Gabriella is going to be telling us tonight. Please do.
I'm going to minimize everyone's faces for now, but obviously when there are questions, I'll bring it back up. So I'm just going to go as if everything is going fine. So please tell me if there's something wrong. So thank you so much for having me. I'm Gabriella Kountourides. And I'm going to talk to you today about the biosocial perspectives on the premenstrual experience. And as Camilla said, I was a member of Radical Anthropology when I did my master's at UCL. And I dug around on my Twitter the other day and found this tweet from 7 years ago. And this was the summer that Homo naledi was discovered. And Chris Stringer brought a 3D print of Homo naledi's lower jaw. And you can just see Camilla in the background there. And this was one of the first talks of RAG that I came along to. And a few talks later, I saw Camilla with a bag of greens and we got into conversation, and she has rabbits and I have rabbits. These are my two, Achilles and Zahavi here. And so after that, well, I was kind of hooked. So thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real honor to be back where my kind of human evolutionary journey started. So it's a nice full circle. Okay, so a little word on language before I get started. So a lot of studies looking at menstruation use the term woman. And when I talk with people around the world, this is the word that mostly comes up to describe people's experiences. And I want to take a moment just before I start to recognize that not all women menstruate and not everybody who has periods identifies as a woman. And in this talk, I will use the word woman, but I want to acknowledge early on that there are some issues with this. So it doesn't cover everybody who menstruates, nor is it a prerequisite for being a woman. Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about one of the first studies that I've done for my PhD. And the title is Just How Negative is the Premenstrual Experience? Combining an experimental design with text analysis. So essentially for this study, we did an online survey and we had 3 different framings of a question about PMS and used text analysis to look at the results. So before I get started on the actual study, I'm going to give you an outline of what the talk will entail today. So I'm going to start by introducing premenstrual syndrome. And then I'm going to move on to how we measure PMS. And then I'll spend some time discussing the methods of my study. And finally, the results. So I'm in the final year of my PhD, and there are a few outstanding questions that I have from this paper, which I'm hoping to submit next week. So I'd love your opinions at the end. I have a few questions for you, and then obviously I would love to hear your questions as well. Okay, so historical accounts of menstruation are rich in their diversity. This here you can see on screen is the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus. It's the oldest medical text that we have, written during the reign of Pharaoh Amenhotep II in 1800 BCE. And this attributes illnesses ranging from eye soreness and muscle ache to the womb. The Huangdi Neijing is one of the oldest Chinese medical texts from the Han Dynasty era. It discusses menstruation and suggests that menstruation invites imbalance. Pliny the Elder warned about the dangers of menstrual blood in his Natural History in 79 AD. And he suggested that contact with menstrual blood turns new wine sour and crops touched by it become barren. Then Dr. John Burns, in his Principles of Midwifery in 1811, wrote that menstruation is to be considered as a disease. Finally, Bella Schick described a toxin in menstrual blood, which she termed menotoxin. And the photo you can see here shows the effect of menotoxin in cinerea. The flower on the right is placed in normal blood serum and distilled water, and the flower on the left in menstrual blood serum and distilled water. Dr. Schick suggested that this toxin could destroy plant life and prevent beer from fermenting, but unsurprisingly, these results could not be replicated. So menstruation has influenced culture and behaviours, well, since humans have been around, and culture has also influenced how humans view menstruation. I've got some examples here of menstrual huts, celebrations around menstruation, menstrual cave art and Jewish perspectives on menstruation, and down in the corner, a taboo to enter a temple in Bali if you are menstruating. But I'm not going to talk to you about menstrual taboos and menstrual celebrations. You have members of Radanth here who are far more experienced and knowledgeable in this field than I am. What I'd like you to take away from this is that menstruation is often viewed with a dual lens. Something is sacred because it's important to reproduction, but also something unclean and impure. In many Western countries, negative discourse surrounding menstruation is embedded in public dialogue, and the act of experiencing life as a woman is viewed as symptomatic. One part of womanhood that is exposed to great scrutiny is PMS. So what is PMS? Well, PMS, or premenstrual syndrome, is the name we give to a collection of more than 200 different symptoms that women experience the week before their periods. These can range from headaches to cramps to irritability. More than 80% of women have experienced one or more symptoms of PMS, and there are a number of therapies in place to treat it: cognitive behavioral therapy, antidepressants, anti-inflammatories, and hormonal contraceptives. It also features a lot in public discourse. What you can see here is an NHS webpage describing PMS, which it suggests that most women have PMS at some point. So there's a long list of symptoms there. So why might PMS exist? Well, the menstrual cycle is described as a hormonal cycle. Once a month, you see these changing cycles of progesterone and estrogen trigger the uterine lining to break down and be shed. That's menstruation. It occurs around here. While the menstrual cycle can be understood in terms of hormones, we can also view it from an immunological perspective. So progesterone, which you can see here in yellow, has anti-inflammatory properties. And just before menstruation, you see this huge drop in progesterone levels, which triggers a massive inflammatory response, which is menstruation. It's an inflammatory event. And so one might expect a lower mood during this time because low inflammation is often associated with lots of different symptoms, such as low mood, cramps, headaches. When progesterone levels are high, like here, inflammation is reduced, which means that women's immunity is not constant throughout the month like men's is, but it's cyclical. And it has been suggested that these differences in chronic systemic inflammation could actually directly lead to the symptoms of PMS. In fact, a number of studies have shown that inflammatory markers are positively associated with PMS symptom severity. So the worse the symptoms of PMS, the higher the markers of inflammation are. As such, inflammatory states seem to have an association with PMS, and negative experiences shouldn't be conflated with disease if they are normal manifestations of the hormonal cycle. So if PMS is normal and expected, then why do we see so much variation in both the types of symptoms and the severity of the symptoms that people have? What could be driving these differences? So social expectations are views held by, sorry, I've just skipped two, okay, here we go. So these experiences are expected to vary with ecological and environmental factors, things like age and use of hormonal contraception. In a study of 114 women in Bangkok, Thailand, a young age was found to be a risk factor for PMS. And if the use of hormonal contraceptives is accounted for when investigating PMS, given that steroid hormones are often prescribed in the treatment of PMS, then it's important we include those as well. However, biological states don't exist in silos. in addition to the biological experience, such as whether or not they're taking hormonal contraceptives, their levels of stress, age, things like that, a woman exists in a socio-cultural environment. And this can also impact the way that she experiences her premenstrual phase. So, social expectations are views held by people in society that can affect how women experience their menstrual cycles. For example, some studies have shown that there is improvement for women in their symptoms of cramps after they've been given a placebo. So what that's telling you is if they are expecting to have something that's going to solve or reduce their symptoms of cramps, then it actually does result in reduction of those symptoms. And that actually demonstrates the potential effect that expectations can have on symptoms. Pathologizing conversation around PMS, so talking about PMS and menstruation more generally in a very negative way, can act as a nocebo effect. So a nocebo is the opposite of a placebo. So whereas a placebo, you expect something good and you experience something good, a nocebo actually initiates a cycle of inflammation because the body is expecting something negative. And this has been shown in the lab. So if the conversation around PMS is negative, then this acts as a nocebo effect. This creates the belief that the premenstrual experience, so I'm now using the word experience to describe the week before menstruation rather than PMS. So it creates the belief that the premenstrual experience is debilitating. That leads to an inflammatory response. And the symptoms of this inflammatory response are typically those described by women in their premenstrual phase, so headaches and anxiety, for example. So there is no test that can be used to diagnose PMS. Tools are used to measure these symptoms. For somebody to be diagnosed with PMS, they typically have to fill in a questionnaire that looks something like this. And they demonstrate that the symptoms are both cyclical, so occurring just before the period, and also interfere with daily life. And you'll notice here that these are tick boxes and Likert style questions. So how bad, mild, moderate, or severe. Now, because there isn't a biological marker to diagnose PMS, not one like you might see for COVID, you know, you take a lateral flow and you've got COVID or you don't, there is nothing like that that exists for PMS. And so what happens is now we've got over 60 qualitative instruments to collect data about women's menstrual experiences. And these focus mainly on the negative effects of the premenstrual phase. So asking about things like depression, anxiety, bloatedness, and cramps. While the experience of the premenstrual phase is usually thought of as negative, women also report positive experiences, such as heightened creativity prior to menstruation. But this perspective is rarely captured by data collection tools or even conversations around the premenstrual experience unless you're specifically asking for it. Omitting positive symptoms from diagnostic tools may prevent a comprehensive understanding of the premenstrual phase. Now, if measures and tools include only negative symptoms, then this can lead to a self-fulfilling prophecy of expecting and then experiencing negative symptoms. Does it perhaps even prime women to consider the premenstrual phase negatively? Studies have found that priming women affects women's reports of cycle-related symptoms. For example, showing a woman a video describing the link between the menstrual cycle and low mood increased expectations of negative mood changes and lowered expectations of positive changes. So they can have really quick impacts on people's perspectives. This study by Kreisler et al. Found that if women were given a menstrual joy questionnaire, which was formulated to ask specifically about positive aspects of the premenstrual phase, rather than a menstrual distress questionnaire, they reported more positive attitudes towards menstruation. They also found that the order of positive and negative survey administration had an effect. So if you were given a menstrual joy questionnaire before a menstrual distress questionnaire, the respondents gave more positive changes in their answers, whereas if they were given the menstrual distress questionnaire first and then the menstrual joy questionnaire, they gave more negative changes in these answers. So given this, The extent to which PMS is inherently negative and or the result of this medicalized framing remains unclear. So in my study, we aim to address this gap by investigating whether framing the premenstrual experience as being both negative and positive would allow individuals to report more diverse and positive experiences than usual. So we hypothesized that questions framed to encourage people to think about their positive premenstrual experiences would affect how negatively they would report these experiences and maybe even report some positive experiences. And the reason we're trying to do this is not because we don't believe women or think that PMS is negative. I mean, it absolutely is. That's what millions of women around the world are reporting. The reason we're doing this is because it's important that our tools are capturing every element. For example, if somebody has PMS but is reporting positive symptoms as well, it's really important that we don't give medication that might affect those kind of positive symptoms. If somebody has cramps and headaches and also heightened creativity before their periods, you don't want to obliterate all three. You don't want to give, for example, hormonal contraception so that they don't necessarily have a premenstrual phase and then they don't have that creativity anymore. So that's why it's important to really understand it's not about ignoring women's experiences, but really listening carefully so that our tools are useful for women. So we used an online survey to collect text data on the premenstrual experience. Participants were recruited through tweets and push notifications on an app released by Clue. This is their logo down here. And Clue is a free period tracker app based in Germany. Clue sent out some tweets, and after 1 month, we had 200 survey responses. Subsequently, Clue sent out notifications to 30,000 randomly selected app users with their app language set to English. So therefore, the respondents were not restricted by geographic location, but rather by user language. And that's important because the language around PMS varies by language. And so I speak English, and this study needed to be done in English because that's the nuances that I can understand. But if it were to be replicated in other languages as well, that would be really, really great. So participants followed the links to a survey, and you can see an example of it here, and hopefully did that survey. In the survey, there were a maximum of 21 questions, and these depended on individual experiences. So we had just over 4,500 people click the link to do the survey. We excluded anybody who did not agree to participate, who didn't give us informed consent. We excluded anybody under 18 years old, and we excluded anybody who didn't have a menstrual bleed in the past 3 months. We also excluded people who didn't complete the survey. So we were left with 2,638 responses. And those are split into 3 groups, which I'll talk about in a second. So our survey collected data on age, level of partner support, whether you have a partner, the medication you're taking, country of birth, residence, vitamin use, contraceptive use, lots of different questions. It also, most importantly, asked about the premenstrual experience through a free text entry question box. So our participants, as I showed you just here, were randomly allocated to 3 different treatments. Everything in the questionnaire was the same except for the question on PMS. In this question, they were asked to describe their premenstrual experiences using a slightly different framing. Some were asked about general experiences and others more specifically about positive and negative experiences in varying orders. So each group was shown a slightly different wording for the question. The control group was assigned a question that is consistent with the questions asked by medical professionals. Please tell us about any changes, e.g. physical, social, psychological, emotional, behavioral, you experience in the week before your period. And this was answered in a single generic text box entry. Treatment 1 was assigned the question, please tell us about any negative and or positive changes, and again, e.g. physical, social, psychological, emotional, behavioral, that you experienced the week before your period. And this was answered in 3 boxes, which were marked as negative changes, positive changes, and other. Treatment 2 was assigned the question, please tell us any positive and or negative changes, and the rest was the same, except it had positive first and then negative and then other. So thus, treatments 1 and 2 were assigned a question that would specify the type of change, negative or positive, experienced, but in a different sequence. Negative first, positive, or positive first, and then negative. At no point in the survey did the words PMS or premenstrual syndrome appear. And this was to avoid biasing responses, because if you think of the words PMS or premenstrual syndrome, often has a negative connotation, which is why we stuck to premenstrual experience. Okay, so this is a small example of some of the text that was collected. I'll leave that up on screen whilst I have a sip of water. So it's a good point for a break. Okay, so now we're in the fortunate position of having over 2,500 responses, some very short and some very long. These nuanced data are at a scale for which typical qualitative methods are not practical. So how do we work through it? So I hope you'll indulge me, but I'm going to spend a little while on the methods now. Internet surveys are gaining in popularity, and tick box style questions have associated issues with them. So I'm really excited about the potential new avenue that this methodology offers. I'm going to go into some detail on it, and obviously I'd be happy to talk about it after as well. So in this study, we pioneer the use of sentiment analysis to investigate the effect of framing on descriptions of the premenstrual experience. We can use text analysis to quickly analyze women's responses that document their unique experiences, preserving both quality and quantity of the data. Text mining is often described as the extraction of useful knowledge from textual data, and it involves an automated process of cleaning and processing text to provide thematic analysis. It also creates polarity scores through sentiment analysis, in which one mines a body of text to understand the main opinion or sentiment it holds. So basically, using a computer to go very quickly through large amounts of text to score things as positive or negative, or even assign sentiments to them. And this is a flow of the work that I did to do this, and I'm going to take you through it in more detail. So we'll kind of dive into it now. Okay, so the first thing to do is clean the text. All of this was done in R, and when this is published, hopefully, the script will go up on GitHub, which people can then use to download and recreate the flow and replicate what I've done, or even better, adapt it to more research. That'd be cool. Anyway, the first thing I did was clean the text. And this is really important because texts written in questionnaires are often unedited. You get typos and abbreviations that occur. And similarly, the same words can be represented differently. So PMS, premenstrual syndrome, or premenstrual syndrome with a hyphen between it. So to address this, I made a cleaning function. And the cleaning function was adapted from code written by the Text Clean package. And that was made by Rinka in 2018. So the cleaning function involved things like making all the words lowercase, replacing numbers, removing white space, and expanding any abbreviations. The next thing to do was to score responses. So I start with my with the raw data, and I clean it, and I end up with my clean data. Down one branch with the clean data, I then made a dictionary. Okay, so I used the Sentiment R package, which is also a package by Rinka, to score the text. Now, the way polarity scoring works, i.e. how positive and how negative are sentences, is by comparing words in the text that I've got from my respondents to a predefined dictionary of words. This is called a lexicon. And an algorithm essentially assigns positive, negative, and neutral tags to these sentences. So I've got a small cut of just the generic dictionary here, and you can see that words have been assigned with different scores, and these are crowdsourced, and I can go into a little bit more detail on that later, and also provide some links if people are interested. So on top of just assigning polarity scores to a word, for example, atrophy is -0.5, You have to also take into account what people are saying in the rest of the sentences, because sentences aren't just made up of single words next to each other. The words between the words impact how positive or negative, or may even inverse the meaning of that sentence if you're being sarcastic, for example. And sarcasm is notoriously difficult to pick up if you're a computer. So the other thing that we use is negators, shifters, and intensifiers. So words such as not or really are accounted for in the final polarity score, because there's another dictionary that essentially takes the score of the word and then applies an intensifier or reverses the polarity score depending on the word. So I've got some examples here as well. For example, colossal will enhance the meaning. So if you have colossal and attack, it will be even worse than minus 0.75. So I think this is really cool in itself, but the problem is these dictionaries are predefined, and it takes a lot of work to make these dictionaries, and they are made to use in marketing and reviews. And the way you make these dictionaries is you train a model, and it needs to be able to adapt to the different kind of areas that you're looking at. Now, we're not aware of any data sets about menstruation, like tagged data sets around menstruation, that we could use to train a model to then accurately classify responses as positive or negative. Not only are we not sure about any dictionaries for menstruation, none for female health, none for women specifically. So there's a big, big gap here. So what I had to do for this study was to edit the dictionary that already existed. And so some words that kind of jump to mind are things like tender, which is often scored positively in day-to-day life. But if you're talking about menstruation and you're talking about the premenstrual phase, tender is actually in relation to sore boobs, and it's a negative. So that had to be inversed. And there was plenty of words that weren't included as well. So I added all of those. So I adapted that default dictionary in the Sentiment R package and created this custom dictionary. But it would be really cool if somebody made this dictionary for women's health. It's something that I'd love to do when I finish my PhD, but if someone gets there first, even better. So there's a project for anybody who's into computers, please go for it. Okay, so the next thing we had to do is, instead of going down the line, if I just go back to this original here, is if we go, I don't know why this is moving at the bottom. So on one side, we cleaned the data, made the dictionary, scored it. And on the other side, this is where I'm now going to, on the other side of that branch, we wanted to look at word diversity. So not just assigning scores to words, but also actually understanding and looking at what the words are saying and what they're meaning. And we wanted to answer the questions: what similar words are there, what unique words are there, and what is the lexical density? So how many unique words are there when you compare the three treatments to each other? And to do this, we removed things like stop words, which is essentially words that don't carry meaning. So and thus and the were removed. And then also we lemmatized words. So when various forms of a word are grouped together so that they can be analyzed as a single word, for example, hunger and hungry would be grouped together as hungry. So we use this to look at what the similar words are between each of the three treatments, and also what the unique words were. Okay, so after we removed the unfinished responses, we had just over 2,500 people in our study. Participants were aged 18 to 54 years old. Altogether, about 17% of them used hormonal contraception, 458 women. This figure is a little bit lower than what we had expected. The United Nations says that the worldwide use of hormonal contraceptives is 21.5. So it's not that far off, 17%, but the difference is probably because one of the inclusion criteria was having had a menstrual bleed in the past 3 months. So if somebody was on a contraception that prevented them from having menstrual bleed, then they wouldn't have been in the study. And so we have a slightly lower number than normal. In terms of where they were from, our participants were born in 117 different countries, the majority of which were in the UK. That's 713 people. We had 597 born in the States, 248 in Australia, and 113 in Canada, though there were individuals from all 5 continents, which was quite nice. Okay, so some of the initial results that we have. So what you can see here is a count of how many people had this score, and on the bottom the actual polarity score. Now remember, the control group is the medicalized form of the question, so just a very generic single text box, what are your experiences the week before, whereas the treatment 1 and 2 are the different ways of saying what are the positive and negative, or what are the negative and positive experiences you have. So just bear that in mind. Okay, so the control is in pink and the treatment 1 in green and treatment 2 in purple. And what you can see here is that all of them are shifted towards the negative, which suggests that overall the premenstrual phase is seen in a negative way. In the dashed line, you can see the mean score. And the mean score for the control group was minus 0.25. And the mean score for the treatments 1 and 2 were minus 0.16 and minus 0.15. And you actually can't tell the difference between treatment 1 and 2 in this graph because they're hidden. What I'd also like to draw your attention to is the spread of the data. So you can actually see that the control group in pink spreads much longer, both along the negative and along the positive, than if you compare it to the treatment 1 and treatment 2. They are also spread, but not as much as the control group. So the range is quite important there. So we did some statistics on our results. And we did two Bayesian models because the data that we got was quite complicated. So we split the results into 2. I'm going to take you through one model and the results, and then the second model and the results. So we wanted to investigate if the experimental treatment influences the polarity of responses. In our first model, we categorized polarity as positive, negative, and neutral. So if we go back to that previous diagram, in our first model, we wouldn't account for any of this spread. We defined everything as under 0 as negative, everything at 0, and you can see how many people are at 0 in all 3. This was neutral, and then anything above 0 as positive. So we didn't have any information about the range, just the numbers. So we looked at the sentiment, so positive, negative, or neutral, and we analyzed that by the group, so control, treatment 1 or treatment 2, and we accounted for standardized age and use of hormonal contraceptive, and we included residence as a fixed effect. So the result of this first model. So this model found that participants in the treatment groups had double the odds of reporting neutral responses compared to control. So I'll just take you through this graph a little bit. So what you can see here is the control group, the treatment 1 and treatment 2. We've assigned everything as negative in red, neutral in green, the triangle, and positive in blue. And if you look carefully, you will see that there is a slight difference in where the negative line is for the control group when you compare it to treatment 1 and 2. There's not really a difference for the positive one. I mean, you can see it, but there's a big overlap in the range, in the interquartile range as well. And then for the neutral, you can see that the control one has a much lower probabilities, that there are much fewer neutrals in the control group when compared to treatment 1 and treatment 2. So the odds of reporting a neutral response was higher if you were in treatment 1 or treatment 2 compared to the controlled group. No difference between treatment 1 and 2 though. The odds of reporting a positive response in treatment 1 and 2 was not found to be different, and neither was the odds of reporting a negative response. We didn't find any association between use of hormonal contraceptives, nor did we find any association of age. Okay, so the second model, remember, we're trying to understand if our experimental treatment influences the polarity of responses. The second model accounts for this range. So whereas the first model, we grouped everything, the second model doesn't want to look at the zeros, but wants to look at the spread. So the spread below the 0 and the spread above 0. Yeah, so it's the same kind of model. You're looking at the sentiment score by group, including age, use of hormonal contraceptive, and residence as a fixed effect. Okay, so the results. So for this one, this is control group in pink and treatment group 1 in green and treatment group 2 in purple. And these colors are going to be consistent. So if you see these colors, it's the same. Now, figure A over here is the negative score, and you can see it starts at 0 and it actually increases in how negative it is to minus 0.4. And picture B is the positive score. So what we can see here is there is a difference in the negative scoring between control group and treatment 1, between the control group and treatment 2, but not between treatment 1 and 2. Likewise, when you're looking at the positive results, there is a difference in the range of positive responses in the control group. When you compare it to treatment 1, though you can see that it is overlapping, and the same for treatment 2. And again, no real difference between treatment 1 or 2. So within responses scoring negative overall, treatment 1 and treatment 2 were associated with less negative scores than those in the control group. So they're less negative than the ones in the control group. However, within responses scored positive overall, treatments 1 and 2 were associated with less positive scores compared to the control group. And that was really surprising to us. We then looked at the actual content of the words themselves. And we found that the most common words across each group have very similar overlap. So here is the control group right here. Then you've got treatment 1, and then you've got treatment 2. And what this is doing is showing you just the word count. So how many words are found in each group? How many times is each word found in each group? And you can see the top 4 words, top 3 words are very similar. You've got breast, cramp, and emotional, or bloat, some kind of mixture of those 4 words in the top. So a lot of overlap between the words, but you get some words like cry and sensitive that were only found in the control group, and some words like swing and acne only found in treatment groups 1 and 2. We also looked at the lexical density, and I don't know if you can see that. Oh, it's just off slide. Anyway, the lexical density score is essentially the number of unique words divided by the number of words in total. So what it's doing is saying how many, what is the most numerous unique word in each group. And what it's doing is trying to see, actually, do the words overlap between the 3 treatments, or do they not overlap? And what we found, and you can see that here, is that the control group had a much lower lexical density than treatment group 1 and 2. So that suggests that the wording in treatments group 1 and 2 elicit more diverse responses with less repetition when compared to the control. Because what this low lexical density is saying is that regardless of the number of words in total, there were a lot of repetitions. And so actually how many individual words were in this group were much lower compared to these 2, which had many more different symptoms or experiences written in by our participants. And again, the order of questioning positive and negative doesn't make a difference to the diversity and the density of the words used, but not including positive and negative in the prompt of the question, that does predict the density. So to our knowledge, this is the first study to use sentiment analysis of women's self-reported premenstrual experiences to determine whether accounts of the premenstrual experience are sensitive to framing. These results, we think, have implications for how the premenstrual experience is measured, and also challenges the idea that the premenstrual experience is solely negative. We're clearly missing a very neutral element here, where lots of women are not experiencing anything, or experiencing negative symptoms and positive and neutral symptoms at the same time. What it also shows, though, is that regardless of the question phrasing, the polarity of the women's accounts of the premenstrual experiences are overall negative. So there's nothing revolutionary there. PMS is generally negative. And that's what we would expect, given the fact that talking about PMS around the world is usually elicits negative symptoms and reactions. That would make sense. So while framing in marketing affects responses and behavior, we didn't find this to be the case in all parts of the study. We were really surprised to find that the order of questioning didn't make a difference at all. And initially I thought maybe it's just because it's such a quick snapshot, positive and negative, and then negative and positive. But actually a lot of the studying in marketing are also snapshot, one advert flashed up very quickly, and that has been shown to change people's perspectives and change the kind of answers they're giving. So I'm not sure if it's really about the length of time. But drawing on the analysis of all of the text data collected, our results do show that, the premenstrual experience is overall described negatively. And I think one of the main questions that I have outstanding is, why do we see a more positive range of responses in the control group when you compare it to the treatment group? So if I just go back to here, I had expected to see this, so more negative in the negative groups. But what I didn't expect was that the range of positive scores would be lower in the treatment groups, because these were the people that were specifically asked about positive experiences. And I had thought that they would have more positive range scores. And I think maybe that's something to do with the fact that if I skip back, sorry, I'll just skip back quickly to here. It might be because people are listing in the treatment groups 1 and 2, they're listing. And if I go into the text itself, I can see that people are writing in treatment groups 1 and 2 as more of a list of things, negative changes, and then they kind of bullet point the symptoms they experience, whereas the single text box allows people to write kind of longer sentences. So it might be something to do with that, but I'm not 100% sure. And then I'd love to essentially open the floor to questions in a second. I've popped some graphs here, which are not going to be part of my paper, but if people want to talk about it more, I'd be happy to discuss it, ways to kind of assign sentiment groupings to different words as well. And finally, something quite nice, which is like a network diagram of words that usually load together, which I think is really interesting. So you get words like increased appetite, which go together very often, but also are very often linked with increased sex drive. So that kind of suggests that there's something about increased appetite for food that also is linked to increased sex drive before menstruation, which is quite interesting. It's just like, it's quite a nice way to visualize exactly what's going on and what kind of symptoms are loading together. So like mood swings and low energy might be expected that they load together quite frequently. But yeah, I would love to open up to questions now. I will stop sharing and reshare if I need to, but thank you very much for having me.
Lovely. Thank you, Gabriella. That was really clear and short and sweet, and pretty fascinating. Are there questions? We've got anybody would like to raise their hand or just jump in with something? Yeah, please, Yasmin.
Hi, thanks, Gabriella. I really enjoyed your talk. And I found it really interesting in particular that the responses to the more kind of thoughtful question was so much more diverse than the responses to the control question, which was more, I guess, the kind of rote question that you might get asked by a doctor. And it seemed to me to suggest something about the way that, I guess, mainstream medicine discounts women's experiences. And just thinking along those lines, I was wondering if you noticed or if you gathered any details about the demographics of the people who filled in the survey. And I'm thinking particularly in relation to race and class, just thinking about medical racism and medical classism, whether that might have an effect on what it means to be asked by somebody, what are your experiences of menstruation, but maybe you're not used to having that much interest shown in your experiences. Thanks again.
Thank you. That's a really, really good question. I'm glad you asked, actually, because I'm not sure I would have mentioned it. So studies around PMS have shown very, very clearly that things like race and class affect PMS. If you go through life as somebody of a minority background and you're experiencing a lot of stress as well and experiencing medical racism, that's going to kind of accumulate with the level of inflammation that you're having anyway with your period. And so it is expected and it's been shown. However, I didn't include any of these questions because this was done with Clue and I wasn't allowed to. So it was initially in my questionnaire. I had questions about religion as well, which I was quite curious about, race, class, things like that. What I have got, but I haven't analysed it yet because it's for the next paper, is if they live in the UK, details about their postcodes, if they wanted to share it. So I've already applied a thing to show kind of their suggested socioeconomic background depending on postcode. But that's all I've got when actually race was really important. And we didn't get that, unfortunately. But this study, we don't have it, but we did do another study and I'm starting to analyze that now. And this was about COVID generally. We've got a preprint out about kind of the effect of vaccines on menstrual cycles, but I'm doing some work to analyze the effect of COVID, living through the pandemic, having COVID and the vaccinations on PMS. And this study was not done in collaboration with anybody except for myself and Alex Alverne, my supervisor, and Susanna Oleska, who's actually here today. Hi, Susanna. And so for this study, we did include all those really important questions. So and questions on PMS. So your question is fantastic. I had the same one, was frustrated I couldn't ask it, but hopefully the next study will reveal a little bit of information about that one.
That sounds really interesting. I can't wait to hear more about it. Thanks again.
Any more?
I have a question, if that's okay.
Lindsay.
Yeah, sorry, somebody was free. I don't know if it was me.
Go ahead.
Gabriella, that was so amazing. Thank you. I'm not a stats person, so my brain's a little bit like, but it was just really, really interesting. I just wanted to comment on that construct you'd mentioned around menstrual joy. Like, even though like I'm really into like the PMS and PMDD stuff, I've not come across the menstrual joy construct before. I just think it's important, so that like if I'm going forward, that like it's important to capture all the data, like you're saying, trying to capture the positive stuff as well. So that's really good. So that's what I took from it. My question was, I'm using something like Clue is such a good way to get your research out there, and I was just interested, how did your like kind of formal collaboration with them come about? It's good to know how to access that kind of stuff for databases of people.
Yeah, thank you so much. So just on your stats point, I wasn't a stats person either. This is by surprise, but I found that using R is actually a lot of fun. But I went through school being told by teachers that I was not very good at computers or maths. So this is very unexpected, but fun. For those of you who don't know Dr. Lindsay Matthews, she's just won funding to co-develop a research agenda for PMDD in the UK. So if you're interested, please contact her.
Thanks, Gabriella.
No problem. So your question was about collaboration with Clue. Yeah, so that was done. So my supervisor, Alex Alverne, was there one of their scientific advisors when they kind of started as a startup. And I know that it used to be a lot easier to get access to them, not their data, and I'll explain why in a second, than it is now, because they're much bigger. They're one of the biggest period tracker apps in the world. So I think it's a bit trickier now. If you go on their website, they do have like calls for academic research links and things like that, and affiliations. So I can't tell you how Alex did it. I have no idea. But once I started my PhD, she already had that up and running. But I know a lot of people are kind of starting to use period tracker apps as well, to kind of use the data in them. I will say though, despite the issues of, you know, asking questions that I particularly wanted around race, religion and class with Clue, I'm really pleased that we worked with Clue, because Clue is very, very careful with their data. And so you're never going to get a situation with Clue as it stands now. Don't quote me in 20 years, but you don't get a situation with Clue where they just send you your data. It's really, really, it's a very rigorous process. They anonymize all of the data. They really go through it. They have a team of statisticians working on it. So wherever you're going to get the data to get kind of information like this, I think it's important as researchers that we're kind of doing those checks to make sure that they're not using people's data irresponsibly. People are using these apps and they're trusting them with a lot of details about their life. It's not just menstrual cycles. You know, Clue has information about your bowel habits and sex life and gym and all of this. And so it's important that we do our due diligence in who is supplying this data. But I know that with COVID, there's been a lot of people starting to use apps. So I can't tell you how to do it because I haven't tried it myself, but I wonder if it is just a case of continuously writing emails to different people in the company and waiting for one of those fish to bite.
Oh, thank you. No, it's really interesting, and I would love to catch up with you more at some point in the future. So good stuff.
That'd be great.
You got any more?
There's Lindsay. Oh, I see. That's no, sorry. That's Lindsay's already spoken.
Lindsay just asked.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I was not going to say anything myself, but I was just wondering whether we could possibly hear from Jacob Fischel. I know he's not got his camera on or his microphone on. That's simply because Jacob, on other occasions, has told us about his theatre in the States, where menstruation seems to be quite an issue among quite a lot of the people, the actresses. And it's quite a big event, and I think he's right in saying that people tend to kind of swear in a kind of a comical way about the fact they're all having their periods together. But whether that's relevant, it won't be relevant to this paper, to this article, I don't think. But it's just possible future research on issues of sort of perceived togetherness in menstruating, and you know, and that, I mean, that's for me, it's always been an interest, because of course, okay, just to say one app, I can't remember how many people were involved in it, but Camilla was showing it around, seemed to show that the actual length of the menstrual cycle is much closer to the lunar length of cycle than was previously realized. It's pretty damn accurately lunar among women of the body mass index, roughly corresponding to what hunter-gatherers would have had, and it really is quite surprising that it comes out as pretty much 29.5 days. So, I mean, those issues, I would just love somebody to be able to do some research on, because they're just biologically, and in terms of human evolution, very, very significant, and yet almost totally ignored by evolutionary theorists. But whether Jacob wants to say anything or not, I don't know. Are you there, Jacob? Do you feel like saying anything? No, he's probably
busy.
He's probably busy cooking a meal or something. Yes, it happens so often on Zoom.
Yeah, no, interesting. That's a really interesting comment. I mean, I know, you know, I've been to RAG plenty of times, and I love listening to you and Camilla talking about the sex drive theory, and it is very, very interesting, the kind of connections that the periodicity and cyclicity of the menstrual cycle could have with the lunar cycle, and that potentially women syncing together. On the other side, my supervisor did a paper which was kind of about, you know, looking at the fact that women statistically don't sync together. And so I think there's definitely some space to kind of use text analysis, because what's interesting today, is it the fact that women sync or don't sync? Thinking about the kind of environments that we live in, none of us right now here on this Zoom are living in any kind of hunter-gatherer style environment. So what's interesting to us is actually, well, what's interesting to me is not statistically do they sync with each other or sync with the moon, but it's how much those beliefs are inbuilt into our conversation and rhetoric around it. And so I think text analysis could be a really cool way to look into this. I'm really interested in seeing what women think about it. Yeah, so thank you.
Just coming in there, people like Brienne Fars, of course, have done kind of ethnographic analysis. And what do you see as how different a text analysis is from a kind of standard anthropological ethnographic analysis? How would you describe that? Actually, it's quantitative.
Yeah, I think I would say that it sits somewhere in the middle. So it doesn't give you the same depth as ethnographic research does, for sure. You know, I'm not getting to know these women, and I'm not getting any more information other than the questions I'm asking. It's very different to be sitting opposite someone and letting somebody speak. And, you know, a lot of you, I'm sure here I can see, actually, I know a lot of you are qualitative researchers. And yeah, these questionnaires will not get the same depth of responses. So you're definitely kind of, you know, weighing up. But what this technique has that just pure quantitative doesn't, like tick boxes, is it does get a little bit of that diversity and a little bit of that depth of information in it. So, you know, I like quantitative research and I like numbers, but, you know, what anthropology has really given me is a grounding in the fact that numbers aren't everything. A lot of the information we have is medicalized, and actually, you know, if we really want to characterize human behavior and human understanding, we need to talk to humans and not just give them numbers. And so I think it's like a nice way to fit in the middle. It's a good way to convince policymakers that things are an issue, because you come backed up with, you know, thousands of responses, but also you have to remember that you're not necessarily getting that depth. And so I think maybe a nice way forward is to kind of do an iterative approach. So the way I see it happening, bearing in mind this study was not meant to happen as it was. COVID put a spanner in the works. This was supposed to just be a pilot, and it ended up being one of the main studies, but that's fine because it was a good one. But the way I would like it to go, knowing what I do now, is start off with some focus groups to make sure that I'm getting the right questions in that questionnaire. I did a little bit of that, but not as much as I would have liked, because I thought it was a pilot. So note to anybody who's going to do a research project, in case of another global pandemic, just assume that nothing is a pilot and you can use everything, because you might not get another chance. But anyway, I would have liked to have a focus group to kind of figure out exactly the kinds of questions, then go forward with that and do the survey, and then go into the survey and look at the questions depending on what I'm interested in at the time, and really contact them for interviews. And actually, in the study that we've done with Susanna and Alex, the COVID study, I think that has like 20,000 responses, maybe more. I can't, if Susanna's still here and I'm wrong, let me know. But we can then go into that, and people have opted into giving us their emails if they're happy to be contacted. And so we each have different research interests. Susanna's quite interested in long COVID. I'm interested in PMS. And so we can read through the responses, or at least even pick out the responses. It takes a lot of time to go through 20,000 responses to look for PMS. You can do it very quickly with text analysis, and then kind of get an understanding of their background. Maybe there's, I don't know, 5,000 people that talk about PMS, and then I can use this sentiment analysis to kind of get framings of what people are talking about, and then I can narrow down and interview 10, 20, 50 women. But I've already done that background research. So I think they work nicely together, basically.
We got some more thoughts. Okay, go ahead, Anoa. Need to unmute. Enoa?
Hi.
Hi, hello. I'm sorry, just from my phone, and it's not the most comfortable thing to use sometimes. I'm also charging it. So anyway, thank you so much, Gabriella, for the talk. It's been really nice to listen to you. And I really loved the little elements at the bottom of the presentation, the little arrows. It really helped follow the overall narrative for the presentation. So my question is, I'm a PhD researcher in a very similar field as yours. I research on menstrual health and especially menstrual pathologies from a philosophical perspective. So I'm not a statistical person either. My thoughts are with making the pathological normal or making the normal pathological. And speaking of PMS as something that we should normalize and kind of swallow the pill that all women need to feel uncomfortable 5 to 2 days before the periods, or whether we should look at it as something that doesn't need to be the case. You spoke about the immunological effects of progesterone, and my research personally has shown that progesterone also has cognitive effects, having to do with cognitive receptors of serotonin and different substances that will make us slightly more prone to feeling sad or having depressive thoughts or being triggered more easily. So any kind of hormonal imbalances with these specific hormones can make us more prone to paranoid thoughts or depressive thoughts. So my question is, where is that line between the normal and the pathological, and when should we be speaking about something that, because it's frequent, we look at it as something that we just need to deal with, or something that women should look at? And I have the same views as you when it comes to the word women, but I know that it's just useful to use it in this way, or whether it is something that women should look to manage or even mitigate through lifestyle or other kind of like tools.
Great, fascinating question, and it's nice to see you in person. We've spoken a little bit over email and through the EMPH seminar, so thank you for coming along. Really interesting question and super interesting research that you're doing. So is this something that, okay, that we accept that women experience, and it's just something that women have to suck it up and deal with? It's a really difficult question, especially when you think about, pathological and syndrome, and all these words are associated with deviation from the norm. But if all women are experiencing the same kind of cyclicity in their hormones and in inflammation, it's not really deviation from the norm, it's deviation from the male norm, which is a consistent cycle. It's not a cycle, I mean, there are fluctuations, but it's pretty straight. And women's are kind of more up and down in terms of their hormones and different inflammatory factors coming in and out. So I think, and a lot of papers talk about, and research talks about PMS as like a disease or a syndrome or something, bad. But I don't think it can be thought of as pathological, because everyone experiences it. It's like saying that, I don't know, having stomach cramps after eating a really heavy meal is like pathological. It's not, it's expected. What is pathological, what's really bad, is if you have Crohn's disease, and that affects a small minority of the population, and that that can be treated. But PMS, maybe reframing it as something that's expected, this kind of changing in what your experiences are the week before your period is expected. But that's not to say that women should just suck it up and deal with it. If women are experiencing terrible symptoms consistently every month, just because it is expected doesn't mean that it should be ignored. And there's so many different things that can be done. So, I mean, firstly, I'm a kind of great believer in people being told or knowing and being equipped with the knowledge of what's going on in their bodies. And so, perhaps if they are prone to really bad PMS, just taking that into consideration when making plans and stuff. But I'm not going to say, oh, I think you know, women should just do a bit of yoga the week before their period, and then they'll be fine. You know, it's not all about lifestyle change. It's also about kind of tracking what is a normal level of discomfort. So, you know, there is a huge inflammatory reaction going on in your body, and it's not going to happen without any pain at all. But once that pain crosses over into something that is debilitating, like PMDD, for example, or really severe PMS, then that needs to be looked at more carefully. And I think we can, by looking at things like, you know, what underlying contributions are there to high inflammatory levels, what's going on. You know, if PMS is inflammatory, then why might somebody suddenly develop really bad PMS? Is there, you know, are they fighting off an infection? Do they have an infection? And, you know, the body is really putting a lot of energy into that instead. And there's, you know, there's some work done on this as well, on potentially using not severe PMS, but changes in an individual's PMS as cues to whether they might have other infections that they've not noticed. So actually what's really important in this one, I think, is probably for individuals to know their own bodies and know what's going on. And if there is a sudden change, then that might be a clue to something that is that's amiss, or that they should investigate closer. Like nobody, and I know it's kind of compounded in just general rhetoric that, you know, periods are really uncomfortable and PMS is a terrible time. But I think because of that conversation, women expect that they should have to live and suffer. You know, if there's something hurting, 100% you should go to the doctor. So it's definitely not something of just kind of sucking it up. I think I've answered your question. Let me know if there's anything else.
Yep, no, that's perfect. Thank you so much, Gabriella.
You got anybody else wants to come in? I was just going to push a little bit more on the kind of social part of the biosocial, and just refer back to Emily Martin's very famous piece in Blood Magic and elsewhere, of course, her correlation of PMS with the experience of generations. And of course, for working class women, it's many generations. For more middle class women, perhaps fewer generations, who are meeting the demands of kind of 9 to 5 clock schedules at work. And so she's trying to fit PMS into that social context. Where would you try to go with this form of analysis to try and investigate how much that type of social environment is affecting the situation? For instance, women that have much more control over their time compared to women that have less control. Issues like working from home compared to not working from home, or stuff of that kind.
Thank you. I think there was a slight disruption, but I think I got it. I love Emily Martin's work, and thank you for asking that question. So it's really interesting. So for those of you who haven't heard of this kind of stuff before, it's essentially the idea that, and a few different people have come up with it, but it's essentially the idea that if women are in charge of their own lives and their own time and can schedule as they want, and I'm not talking necessarily like how we are now, kind of scheduling meetings and stuff, but like actually, you know, just doing what they want when they want to, when they need to, that things like PMS are much lower. And it's when women with these cycles and patterns of hormones are forced to kind of stick to what a patriarchal society deems as should be appropriate. So 9 to 5, 5 days a week, for example, when actually maybe a working pattern that might be better for women might be 4 days and longer days, or, you know, choosing the days that they're taking off and choosing the days that they're working, depending on where they are in their menstrual cycle. So kind of like menstrual leave, but I'll get onto menstrual leave in a minute because I'm not convinced by that either. But there's definitely some really interesting stuff about how your social environment affects PMS, like your time, but also things like who your partner is. So Jane Ussher did some really cool stuff on whether your partner is supportive and whether your partner is of the same gender or a different gender, whether they've got some understanding of what you're going through. And that also has been shown to really mitigate and kind of help reduce symptoms of PMS as well. And this has kind of led to some feminist researchers actually saying, PMS isn't PMS. What it is a manifestation of women being forced to fit themselves into a box that men have made. And it's this period of the month where everybody knows that women are allowed to kind of go off the hook. And that's where you get all these memes, women being crazy, crying, eating chocolate, breaking things. And, there is something to be said for, have women taken that as the only time that they've been allocated in the month to actually express what they're feeling and use that to kind of really let it all out. So there's a lot of kind of different things in there. And I think your question on where to take this kind of methodology next is a good one. I mean, I actually don't think anything should be done until we've got a proper dictionary. I think it's really important. We need a proper dictionary to be able to do this properly. So that's the first step. Next, I think it's a really interesting way to look at it. We've got this kind of horrible natural experiment of COVID. What is happening before and after COVID? What about, now people are going back to work? Is that affecting it? Just anecdotally, I've got lots of friends who, they'll just take a few more hours off on the days they've got their periods, or if they've got really bad PMS, and they'll just work a bit harder and catch up, days when they're feeling better. And, for those people who are worried about, whether they're still contributing to their work, like it always evens out. They're just doing it when works best for them. Maybe they want to take a few more hours in the daytime to get some sun and some exercise and work a bit harder at night. So I think that's a super interesting question. And I would love to look at that kind of with working from home and then going back to the office, and the kind of rigidity of 9 to 5. What I don't want it to do is then kind of lead into this whole menstrual leave thing. And I've written a little bit about menstrual leave, because at the face of it, it's a really kind of feminist, women should be in control and leave the office and make it up other days. The problem is even though progressive companies take it on, it has been shown time and time again to slowly rack up and then be a reason for companies not to hire women. And that's not what we want. The problem is not society, it's not women and their bodies, but that's the reality of it. Is it is used as an excuse.
Great. Manchego, do you want to go? And then Amy, and then Chris.
Yes, I thought I understood that you to say that there had been studies done, or that you were trying to allow for the fact that different languages that people use, they may frame these things differently, so that would affect either their the way they express it or their actual sentiment. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, definitely. So language is obviously really important, and I can only interpret English. My French is not good enough to understand, the kind of nuances. Maybe it is, I don't know. Anyway, it's really important that, the research I'm doing at the moment is in English, but the reason that language, and I made a point about it, is so important is because for text analysis, the models are trained on language. And so if the language, a simple translation, word-to-word translation, will omit any kind of differences in sarcasm or sayings or turns of phrases. And so it's, if you want to do it in other languages, you also need a data set that's kind of primed and ready for a different language. So that's one thing. When you're doing the analysis, it needs to be done properly in the language that the data set was made for, which I'm very lucky it was English, because everything is in English, but it's really not good enough. There's lots of different languages around the world, and they can't just be ignored because no one's making data sets for them. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is, there's lots of studies about whether PMS is a word in a different language. So there was a study, I can't remember who did it, but there was a study on Polynesian islands, and it basically looked at obviously it's in English, but it looked at how close the islands were to the mainland and whether they had words or symptoms that were similar to PMS. And they found that the islands closer to the mainland and like a westernized perspective, news, media, TV, all of that, social media, had words for PMS and all of these symptoms, whereas those that were more, that were further away and didn't have as much exchange of knowledge really didn't experience anything like it. And so that's why language is so important, because actually if a language doesn't have a word for PMS or for any of the symptoms, no turn of phrase, no metaphor for it, then it's quite a good suggestion that that culture might not have it at all, which is, yeah, interesting.
So it's like Sapir-Whorf, right?
It's like what?
Sapir.
The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis.
Yeah.
Okie doke. Excellent. That was a great talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Amy, do you want to go?
Sure. It's funny you were just bringing up Polynesian culture, because what I think about all the time is the word taboo and how it's sort of mutated in English to really drop the paradoxal relationship. And then menstruation becomes evil. Looking at that really awesome map of symptom correlation, it made me very curious about, in studies, what sort of free association around language could do for women in these studies. Like, I'm a writing and art teacher, so that's like where I'm coming from at this. But if you come to those words and something, like you're saying, like syndrome, what are free association words for us, and how can we use our own relationships to language to start to shift that frame to something positive? And that, I think, like, how do we do that collectively to shift society as opposed to shift the individual, or put the pressure on the individual menstruator? Like, I had a student a few weeks ago who emailed me for an afternoon class and was like, I tried to power through my morning class. My cramps are really bad. I'm so sorry. And I read it and was sort of like, oh, well, are you sending this because you know my work is in menstruation and I talk about menstruation all the time, so you feel safe? Like, is your morning professor a non-menstruator? Like, it brought up all of these questions about how menstruators permission themselves to make choices, and what that relationship is to the language we use in framing. Or I even wondered what would happen when you showed the boxes of like negative effects and positive effects during premenstrual time. What if positive comes first? How does that shift someone's response to those days leading up to menstruation? Those are just a lot of questions I had. And to touch on what Chris was saying about synchrony in theater. I worked in wardrobe for many, many years. And not only do you have a situation where actors are syncing, you also have a situation where wardrobe crews and backstage crews are syncing. And I think a lot of that has to do with how many hours people are spending together, and that you're going through a cyclical ritual process that you're not seeing in most parts of daily life. Even in the 9 to 5, the cycle doesn't break. So just to touch on what Chris was asking of Jacob, because Jacob's probably in rehearsal right now. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. Some really good questions. It's funny you say that about taboo, because when I was putting together this talk, I was going to include a bit more about taboos. And then I thought, you know what, I'm preaching to the choir. Why would I do this? I've got Camilla and Chris here. I'm not going to I'll talk more about my methods, but I was Googling the words taboo, because it is inherently negative. That's how we think of it, but it's not what it is. Forbidden doesn't mean bad. Practices that are taboo are things that you don't do maybe during a specific time or for a specific reason, but we've taken it to mean something bad. And so now taboo plays into this whole negative medicalized talk. So that's really interesting, and I had the same thought. Question about word association. So I can probably work backwards. So I can answer your first question, which was about positive. What happens if you do positive first? So the two treatments. So I had the control, which was the general one, and then I had the other two questions, and that was asking for specific questions. And I didn't show a picture of it, so you probably missed it. But the treatment number 2 had positive, negative, whereas treatment 1 had negative, positive. And I really thought I would get differences. I based on the marketing literature that I'd read, I was sure I would get some differences, just that small order difference. But I didn't get any differences. There was no statistical differences, not in the number of positive, negative, neutrals, not in the range of positives, not in the range of negatives, not in the words that were coming out of it. So I was really surprised, because I had thought the same as you. And for the word associations and the shift in society, I mean, it's a good question. I have the same one. I don't think I have the answer to that one though, but something definitely to think about. Thank you. Sorry, you're muted still. No, you're done. Also, Camilla, I think there's some questions in the chat box I've just spotted.
Okay, go for it.
All right.
Susanna or Claire?
So the first one I think is from Rose. You talked about your next study looking at COVID and PMS. How do you think that they could be linked? What are you going to look at? Yeah. So thank you for the question. I think you can kind of group COVID into 3 separate things. You have the infection of COVID, actually maybe 4. You have the infection of COVID, you have long COVID, you have the vaccination of COVID. These 3 things are illnesses that are associated with inflammation. I mean, we probably all know by now that COVID is this kind of cocktail of inflammation, and that's why it's really bad. So just based on that, I would expect a very clear association between having had COVID, having long COVID, and a smaller one of having the vaccination, just because it initiates a small amount of inflammation initially, just as your body kind of reacts to that vaccine. I would expect there to be an association. The 4th part of COVID is the living through a pandemic. I'm really interested in that, because you're kind of trading off. On the one side, it's super stressful, people are dying, you don't know what's coming next, you're having food shortages maybe, and so all of that kind of stress can really add to any kind of premenstrual distress that people feel. And also stress has been shown to add to inflammation as well, so that will also affect it. On the other hand, as Camilla was saying before, people are suddenly in charge of their own days and times, and so is there some kind of mitigation between being in charge of what you're doing when you're doing it versus the stress of COVID? Bearing in mind, I'm only talking about people who are working from home. I'm not talking about doctors, I'm not talking about cleaners, train drivers, no one like that, because they had to carry on during the pandemic. And those people are perhaps the people who I would expect to experience the most stress in day-to-day life, as well as caused by the pandemic as well. So yeah, I would expect there to be a difference for sure. I wrote an article, maybe I'll send it to Camilla. I wrote an article for the conversation about COVID and general impacts on menstruation, so that might be quite interesting. I'll send it to you as well. And then Claire said, my PMDD is treated with medication for bipolar affective disorder. This acknowledges the high elements of PMDD. This element starts as a kind of joy. Interesting. Thank you for sharing that, Claire. Susanna, this reminds me of the framing in disability studies, that disability is not disabling, culture is disabling. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Totally. And Claire also agrees. Yeah, and some nice comments, so thank you.
Thank you.
Chris has got his hand up. Go for it.
Did you want to say?
Just, I wonder if you could put in the chat, or if anyone could put in the chat, the reference to the very, very interesting Polynesian paper. I mean, that is so suggestive that, because of course, and this is getting back to Camilla's point about Emily Martin. Emily Martin, of course, wrote this superb chapter in that pioneering book, Blood Magic, Buckley and Gottlieb. And her chapter was called, I think, Menstruation, Work and Anger in Industrial Society. Those words perhaps a slightly different combination. Of course, her point was, as Camilla's mentioned, but perhaps it needs to be made a bit more kind of emphatic. She was basically saying that PMS is a Western construct, and that really what's going on is that women are supposed to, because of industrial capitalism and patriarchy, they're supposed to act on that in that period around and before menstruation, just act like it's any other day. For her, that's the problem, because actually you feel like turning everything upside down. You feel like being royalty. You feel like instead of having to run around supporting your husband or your boss, you've got a very low tolerance threshold of patriarchy. And what you really want to do is first of all rebel, and so that looks like anger and it looks like rather negative. But ideally, your rebellion ends up with you being the sort of queen, and everyone else, serving your needs instead of you having to serve their needs. That's a time of particular creativity. Now, obviously, that's a little bit. It's a little bit extreme, and you have to sort of settle down a little bit. And my daughter Olivia, she's got a wonderful, tolerant husband, and she doesn't work for a very vicious employer. In fact, she does most of her own, but she has had terrible menstrual pains. I mean, I'm not so. I realize that all the complexities that your questionnaires bring out are, we really need to be kind of relatively open-minded about all these things. But I still very much support Amy's point, which is that the world is the problem and not you. I mean, ideally, the world should be one made habitable for people who have periods. At the moment, it's a world made for and really habitable by people who don't have periods, namely men. And it needs to, and it's just so important, as Amy says, not to lose sight of that. That actually, just possibly, there's a little kind of a spectrum there in that Polynesian paper. The closer you are to a different world, and I don't think Polynesian islands are probably all that ideal, the closer you are to a different world, maybe the less you even have a word in your language for anything remotely like PMS. And so, and you said this, Gabriella, yourself, you said that you've chosen English because that's your language. But as Manchego said, I mean, there's an issue there. I mean, it really would be very good, wouldn't it, to be able to speak in very different languages, including languages for which there's actually no term for anything remotely like PMS. Because that would be telling you something about the wider issue of what it means to be human, whether male or female. And it is that, I think Amy was hinting at that, there's a bit of a danger that if you use English, you're going to be trapped in a particular set of assumptions. I know you're not, but I'm just saying, the further we can remove from reliance on English, perhaps the better.
Thank you. I would definitely say that I am trapped in a set of assumptions. I would say I am. Really interesting comment. I've closed everything because I didn't want things to bleep during the talk. So I will find that paper and I will send it to Camilla, and then she can maybe send it around, or I'll send it to you. I've got Camilla's email.
Thank you. You may well have sent me the reference earlier.
I think because we spoke, maybe I did, but it would have been a few years ago.
Might have you talked about it, yeah.
Yeah, I talk about it a lot because I think it's super interesting. And actually, what Chris was saying about existing in the world as somebody who menstruates in a world that's built for people who don't menstruate, or like Susanna said, if you're disabled and you live in this society, you're not exactly, life is not made easy for you at all. It's made with zero thought about your day-to-day life. There's lots of different groups like that as well. There is another paper which I will include, which is a meta-analysis of studies on PMS around the world. It does not look at any hunter-gatherer groups. It basically looks at America, Europe, and the Middle East. But what's really interesting to me in that is the one takeaway is like everyone experiences, or most people experiences PMS, or most countries have PMS. But what's interesting is that in this group of countries that they looked at, countries like Iran had 98% of women saying that they experience PMS. And as it, you know, Iran, in the state that it was in when this study was done, women, there is a huge difference in between men and women were expected at the time to be quite quiet and, you know, not really to be in charge of their own fates, whereas in Sweden it had something like a 13% rate of PMS, and it's quite well known for women, you know, being able to dictate their lives a little bit more, and it has good social health care and things like that. So I think that's super interesting. If you kind of think about it, is like maybe PMS is expected, as in you should expect a change just before your period because you have higher and lower levels of inflammation throughout the month, and so that's expected. But in cultures where women are supposed to fit to some kind of box, depending on how non-egalitarian the cultures are, the worse people describe their PMS as being, because it's that, you know, they're allowed to make some noise about what's going on. I mean, I think it's all super interesting. So I'll send you that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it should be mentioned that among African hunter-gatherers, there still is the idea of women's illness is usually mentioned, but these illnesses have magical aspects of connection to animals, powers. There's usually not an expression about pollution. It's usually something about power and connection to either the moon or animals. So it's illness of the moon, or it's illness of the eland, or something of that kind. So yeah, supernatural aspects, which clearly are very little. Most of the users of menstrual apps probably don't think of supernatural aspects. Yeah.
The word illness it almost means the opposite of what it would be translated, because it's the illness is a kind of little death, and a little death is kind of a way of avoiding a big death, and there's all sorts of connections with healing and stuff, which gets translated as illness, of course. But it's anyway. Yes, absolutely right. Yes. Just by the way, tapu, because Amy mentioned this. I had to write in the Encyclopedia of Social Anthropology. I had to write the entry on tapu, and of course it means holy, sacred, set apart. In that sense, prohibited. And the kind of negative thing is of course, but it's negative if there's something holy and you disrespect it. Well, that's negative. But the deeper meaning of taboo is actually sacred, holy, needing to be respected and set apart. And of course, women themselves established it. I mean, the whole point about menstrual taboos is that they were established by women as protection against being harassed at a time when you don't need to be harassed. So all these things tend to get forgotten, and it's really very important to remember them.
Did you want to go in again, Amy? Did you say something?
Did have one more thought. To add on to what Chris was saying before this, I think the questions are, how do we use English to our advantage? If we're living in English-speaking countries, how do we use the language to help us rather than hinder us? Generally, that's with collective metaphor and images and imagery. So how do you use images, or even how do you use something like etymology to revive what's been lost in the language? I think we don't have to, English is not the best, but we don't have to, we could use it to our advantage to create change.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Amy. I agree. And also the idea of incorporating imagery into this is not something that I had thought of. So something to think about for sure. Thank you. And Chris, for the info about taboo. It's super interesting. Yeah, taboo anyway. If anybody is here that is not a member of Brown Dance and has come, they're here for me, please go along to some more. I would really encourage any of Chris and Camilla's talks. If you want to hear a little bit more about language and menstruation, they're super, super interesting. So go along.
In fact, we could say next week is a great talk for anyone who wants to know more, because Chris and Jerome will be talking about the book they're just writing on Know How Women Spoke the First Word. So this will not be too far away from tonight's topic. But Jacob is come out of rehearsal and might be able to have a question. Jacob.
Hi, I actually am in rehearsal, so I've been in and out, but I just wanted to add to the topic of synchrony in the theater, because for 25 years it's happened in every show that I've done where we have more than one menstruator, which is most of the shows, and I was shocked that science can't figure it out. I'm not that shocked. But what we do for a living, what we do morning till night, is that we sing and we dance and we touch each other more than we talk about ideas and framing things in positive and negative. We bypass language through movement and song and repetition of our rituals. The other thing is that we do these rituals at night under very bright lights. And so within 2 or 3 months, the female members of our companies sync up over and over and over again. So there's something about what I caught most of the talk, thankfully, but what was missing for me was what's not language, what's not cognitive framing, and how does the body respond with symptoms or with positive aspects and experiences when it bypasses language and mental constructs, and has that community through touch, through harmony of voice, of song, and synchrony of body movements, and that's done 8 to 12 hours a day. That's my world, and it seems to be something that is preserved in other communities and other cultures that are indigenous, but the West has shut down and boxed up. So there are pockets in the West that speak English that are doing things in a different way, and it might be really cool to bring some of this work into more non-normative spaces to see what we get. So that's my contribution.
Thank you very much. That's super interesting. And actually, yeah, a lot to think about, because at the end of the day, I'm a scientist, as a lot of you are, and I just go with what the evidence is showing me at the moment. So if we can replicate the study that shows that women don't sync up and replicate it in a group like actors who are doing things like what you said, in physical contact with each other all the time, I would really love to do that, because I'd love to see if scientifically it's going on. But also, if women are saying it's going on and then science is finding that it's not, then there's something amiss there. Maybe our measurements are not quite right. If women are saying that it's happening and we're not finding it, then there might be something to reconsider. So I would really like to do, and I don't think it would be a difficult study. It would, if somebody wanted to do a language element or an arty or a dancing element to study that, they should do that. But I think what I would really like to do is just get people to track their menstrual cycles from beginning when they meet to the end and see what happens. Super easy, very low cost, very easy to analyze, but then we've got a nice answer. So if you're keen to do that, let me know, because you've got an in that I don't have, and I would really like to see what the answer is.
Great.
It would be quite significant if we got a result which is different from the usual results. I mean, it could be that, if you like, science is right, and what Jacob thinks is happening is kind of imagined. The women kind of imagine it, and Jacob, you're imagining it. Personally, I doubt it. I really do doubt it, for all sorts of rather deep evolutionary reasons. But on the other hand, I mean, that would be kind of interesting. But I mean, if Gabriella, you did some research, and it kind of vindicated some of what so many women say as their experience of synchrony in conditions of enormous sort of tactile togetherness, I mean, it would make history. I mean, it'd be far more important than that rather over celebrated Martha McClintock article in Nature, whenever that was, which was based on 4 lifeguards or something, which was yes, I mean, it was very bad science. I mean, it was, you know, the McClintock effect is named after Martha McClintock, but actually it was a pretty hopeless study. But if we were to do a proper study, I think it would be very, very, very empowering for all of us, but obviously in particular for women around the world. I mean, it'd just be, you know, instead of having to think that maybe you can be as good as a man if you go on the pill and various things, if you actually if women discovered that actually being female actually intrinsically gives you a particular access of connection with the rest of womankind, I mean, that would be, you know, and that's something which patriarchy has concealed from women over the generations. That would be, I would say, pretty revolutionary.
There's no reason why we shouldn't. It's a very easy study to do, and I think it's made all the more interesting that we approach it from different directions. So I think we should just get on with it. Let's make it happen. It would be really cool. Camilla, we've got each other's emails,
over to you. Yeah, over to you, Gabriella.
Jacob, I hope you don't mind, or Amy, Jacob and Amy.
Great.
Yeah.
Gabriella, did you see this paper the other day about the studies of women's generosity, altruism increasing with the progesterone levels, about the women's close others, that they were creating these links? It was an experimental study. I don't know if it was really.
Yeah, I think this is the one that Rebecca Siri tweeted, isn't it? And then Radant also. Yeah. So unfortunately, no, I haven't read it. It's bookmarked to read. It looks super interesting.
Yeah, it looked really interesting.
Yeah.
It was an experimental study, one of these kind of altruism games type of thing, but suggesting that phase of the menstrual cycle, and particularly increasing progesterone, so that coming up to the being extra generous with their close, socially close but interesting one.
It would also, I need to read it, because also what sprung to mind was some of the work that Andrea Migliana and Ruth May do on kinship, and, you know, whether people share with family, non-family, all of that stuff. So
we're getting near the time, are we, Camilla?
Are there any final questions, or are people satisfied with what's been a really great talk? Thank you so much, Gabriella, for introducing us to all that amazing work.
Thanks for having me.
And I will post up again the lovely article and the conversation that you had on the COVID study as well. And just to say, after saying thanks so much to Gabriella, we're still on Zoom next week, but we will also be at the UCL classroom next week in the Darrell Ford Seminar Room with Chris and Jerome Lewis, talking about their work, their book that's coming out in, well, hopefully finished in the near future, on No, How Women Spoke the First Word. So it really is the backstory of radical anthropology's kind of main theory, but with all Jerome's amazing fieldwork included in that. So we'll hear more about hunter-gatherers next week on this, but plenty more about menstruation as well. So thank you so much, Gabriella. It's been a great talk. It's really been great. Thank
you so much.
To hear all that.
Thanks.
Okay, absolutely brilliant. I think we're all right now.
Okay, bye everybody.